the last couple of weeks, we've been going through the book of Joshua, and we've been looking at the strongholds of Jericho that are destroyed and defeated, by the power of God, and how this destruction of the stronghold sets that pattern, of what's going to happen in the future. Sets that pattern of what's going to happen at the second coming, the dawning of the Messianic age. That's how we've been looking at Joshua, because just as Exodus is a picture, is a type of our salvation and the first coming of Messiah, in a lot of ways, Joshua is a picture and a type of the second coming and what he's going to do there. So hopefully we're not being surveilled right now, But so all of what we were looking at with Jericho and such is that all of the strongholds of the enemy are going to be destroyed and torn down. We know that at the coming of the Messiah, that there is nothing that's going to be able to stand against him. So Messiah, he is as the commander of the armies of the Lord, is going to be victorious. He's going to lead his people to take over the dominion of darkness. He's going to defeat all of that. He's going to rescue people from the dominion of darkness. And so this victory, it's not going to be achieved through all sorts of weapons of flesh and blood or human effort, but everything is going to be by and for his glory. And in looking at Achan last week, how he had taken some of those things that were devoted to Jericho, that were supposed to be devoted to the Lord from within Jericho, how we looked at it in the sense of that he will not allow anyone to take glory for that which is his. He will not share his glory with another. All the first fruits of the victory go to the Lord. And so after the defeat of Ai, when they had realized that something was wrong, they had to do a bit of soul searching. And so they found that sin of Achan and his taking God's glory for himself. And so Achan's sin had, even though it was him as an individual, we talked about it how in the sense of how it had an effect on the whole people. His little bit of leaven worked and affected the entire batch of the nation, the batch of dough of the nation. An individual sin caused a defeat for all of the people. And you're talking, hundreds of thousands of warriors, millions of people. So what we always need to realize and come to terms with is that there is defeat in disobedience. But on the flip side of that, there is victory in what? If there's defeat in disobedience, then there is victory in obedience. Victory is never going to be about tactics. It's never going to be about skill, but upon obedience to his word and his instruction or his Torah, those things. So victory is not by might, nor is it by power, but it is by his Spirit, says Adonai Tzavaot. That's Zechariah chapter 4. So again, after the defeat of Ai, they had to do a bit of soul searching, and they found this stuff out. And so we come to Joshua chapter 8. And we realize that in looking at this, that not even God would not even allow Joshua to claim victory over Ai. He would not allow him to take something which still belonged to the Lord. So it says, Then Adonai said to Joshua, Do not be afraid or dismayed. Take all the people of war with you, and arise and go up to Ai. Behold, I have given the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land into your hand. And then you will do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. Can y'all see that at all? Yeah. Okay. Except you will take its spoil and its cattle as plunder for yourselves. He says, set an ambush for the city behind it. So the idea that this whole chapter is built upon, the idea for the ambush came from the Lord. That previous victory, the previous victory of men, that the men of Ai had over Israel, it had nothing to do with their numbers. It had nothing to do with their tactics or their abilities, but solely on the fact that Israel had sinned. So luring the enemy out is what the Lord was proposing here. Luring them out from their safety, from their security, from their stronghold. Essentially taking advantage of their pride, of their arrogance, their smugness in the fact that they had defeated them so much earlier. Luring them out and setting this ambush, that was not Joshua's idea. And it's not really a unique idea, and that kind of thing, many armies have used such a tactic in the past and in other circumstances. But there's no guarantee that even if you do things like that, use a tactic like that it'll necessarily work. So before Joshua could take credit for anything, or before somebody might be inclined to give him credit for something, he is reminded, and he is given a moment like Moses had back in Exodus chapter 17. It's something that that all the people should remember. Just as Moses had the crossing of the Red Sea, Joshua had that crossing of the Jordan. Here's another parallel between the two. In Exodus chapter 17, verse 9, says that Moses says to Joshua, "Choose men and go out and fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." And so Joshua did as Moses said and fought the Amalekites, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And when Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But when he let down his hand, the Amalekites prevailed. So Joshua's moment is something very similar to this. It may not be quite so dramatic, but it is very similar. In Joshua chapter 8, verse 18, it says, Then Adonai said to Joshua, "Stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand." And so Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand toward the city. And as soon as he stretched out his hand, the ambush arose quickly from their place, ran and entered the city and captured it, and immediately set the city on fire. Because that was the key, that was the turning point of the whole situation. Joshua and a small number had gone up to Ai as before, and when Ai, those men had come out against them, Israel turned and ran again. But that was all the trick. That was the lure. That was the ambush. And they drew them out. They were hoping they would chase them. And of course they did. But this other army that had been lying in wait, lying in ambush, then rose up and took the city while all the men of war were chasing after the Israelites. And as soon as they saw the smoke rising up from the city, you'll read in chapter 8 that Joshua and his men turned and then attacked those that had been chasing them before. And of course they won the day. And so in all of this situation, there is no way that Joshua can claim glory for himself. There's no way that somebody can really give Joshua the credit for what happens in this victory over Ai. It wasn't his idea. None of this was his timing. Everything, although he was doing, was following Adonai's instructions. And again, it's that example of obedience leading to victory. For Joshua, if he had turned and used this situation to get cocky, to claim glory for himself or his military tactics and prowess, that would have been no different than Achan when he was stealing the gold and the silver and the clothing from Jericho. It wouldn't have been any different. So Joshua is making sure, and he wants to make sure, that the Lord gets the credit for everything that is happening. Because the Lord will not share his glory with another. And so with obedience comes this victory. And with that obedience and victory comes even greater acts of obedience and even a greater opportunity to see the fulfillment of God's promise. And we need to understand that. That's how it really does work for us. When we obey his will, when we walk in his ways, that might mean that you experience more opposition. But that also means that I believe that there is more and more of his victory. And when we see more and more of His victory in our lives, then we're going to have greater opportunity to see the plan and purpose of His will unfold in our lives. We'll get to see more of those things, those promises come to pass. We'll be able to see the fulfillment of things that He called for even some time ago in the past. Because after the victory at Ai, in which all the plans and instructions of the Lord succeeded, Joshua then participated in the fulfillment of this instruction that came under the life of Moses. Joshua chapter 8 verse 30 says, "Then Joshua built an altar to Adonai, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal. And as Moses, the servant of Adonai, had commanded Bnei Israel, as written in the scroll of the Torah of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no man had wielded any iron tool, they offered on it burnt offerings to Adonai and sacrificed fellowship offerings." And I don't know if you'll be able to see as much of this, because I thought it was going to be a little more overcast. It was this morning. But it's some maps of Ai and of Israel. Can y'all see that at all? Can y'all make sense of that? Down here, no, you can't see that. I need a pointer. Here we go. Down here is Jericho, and it's in the Jordan Rift Valley. Right up here, this red arrow is the city of Ai. So they're only a few miles apart, but the biggest difference between them is this is down near the bottom of the valley, of the Jordan Rift Valley, and Ai is at the top. Okay? And again, so Joshua is building this altar. See, I can't even see it. Over here you have, this is Mount Ebal on this side, and over here is Mount Gerizim with the city of, what city is supposed to be in between in the valley?
Shechem.
The Shechem is in the middle. This place shows up in the New Testament a few times. This is another outline of it. This is Mount Gerizim over here. Mount Ebal. I'm sorry, I'm looking at it wrong.
No, you're doing right. You're doing good.
Right.
Okay, Mount Ebal is up here. The city is in between. Going up the screen is north. Okay, so when you look at these, again, this is another side view. You have the mountains on each side with the city, the valley down in the middle. But when you look at how the altar was set up, it was set up facing the other mountain. The altar on Mount Ebal was set up facing Mount Gerizim. So that's an artist rendition of it. I don't know if you can see it there, but this is what the altar is today. You see people standing around a little bit, but this was a discovery in the last 40 years or so that they really realized what the significance of this thing was and the importance of it. But what we see is after this first victory, after they'd crossed the Jordan, they had the first victory there at Jericho, but it's down in the Jordan Rift Valley, and it's guarding the way up to the top, to the mountaintops. And so this is now, Ai is now their first victory in the high country. Joshua then takes the people to Mount Ebal in a fulfillment of a command of Moses. And let's see, I don't know if I have the map here or not. Well, one thing that's to notice about this, I thought, where did that go? Well, he takes them to Ebal in fulfillment of a command through Moses. He says, "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse." This is Deuteronomy chapter 11. "The blessing if you listen to the mitzvot of Adonai your God that I am commanding you today, but the curse if you do not listen to the mitzvot of Adonai your God, but turn from the way I am commanding you today to go after other gods that you have not known." So to go in a different way, to go with a different life, a different way of life is essentially to go after other gods. Verse 29 says, "Now when Adonai your God brings you into the land you are going in to possess, you are to set the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal." So when he brings you, when Adonai your God brings you into the land, this is supposed to occur early on in the process that they're supposed to do this. And you think about that. Why is that? Why does it need to happen quickly upon entering into the land? The reason I think it is because really the whole campaign in taking the promised land is a part of that fulfillment of the blessing, of that promise. So everything that happens in taking the land is about experiencing that blessing. And then they need to understand, the Israelites need to understand, in order to complete the taking of the promised land, they need to live and act in terms that is expected of them in order to receive the blessing. That's why he goes into the blessing and the curses. Chapter 27, verse 1 says, "Moses and the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, Keep the whole mitzvah that I am commanding you today. Now on the day when you cross over the Jordan to the land that Adonai your God is giving you, you are to set up large stones for yourself and coat them with plaster. Then you are to write on them all the words of this Torah when you cross over, so that you may enter the land that Adonai your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, just as Adonai the God of your fathers has promised you." Verse 4 says, "Now when you cross over the Jordan, you are to set up these stones about which I am commanding you today on Mount Ebal, and coat them with plaster. There also you will build an altar to Adonai your God, an altar of stones, and you are not to use an iron tool on them. You are to build the altar of Adonai your God of whole stones, and you are to offer up burnt offerings on it to Adonai your God. You are to sacrifice fellowship offerings and eat there, and you will rejoice before Adonai your God. You are to write on the stones all the words of this Torah very clearly." Okay? Can y'all following along with me? So shortly after they entered the land, if they're going to be obedient, they're supposed to go to Mount Ebal. And if you ever wondered why they went to Ai as opposed to somewhere else, here's that map. Here's the other map I was telling you about. Again, Jericho is down here at the base of the mountains in the Jordan Rift Valley. You come straight up here and you get to Ai, but there are other pathways, other ways they could have gone. But I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this map. Again, this is another map. I don't know if y'all can see it here. Where am I looking for? Okay, there is where they come across the Jordan, where they have the Jericho, and then Ai and Bethel are right up here. And I'm going to zoom in over here. When you get to see Ai, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal are like right up here. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's like one road that connects them. And the guess who guards that road? It's the city of Ai. The Ai is the one that gives them first access to the road that will take them straight to Mount Ebal. And so that's one reason why they go that way. It leads across the hill country to that mountain. So in coming up from the Jordan Rift Valley, with Jericho guarding the base of the ascent, Ai is at the top guarding the road. So in order for them to obey Moses, Joshua has to lead them to Mount Ebal and set up the altar, begin the process of writing the words of the Torah. He has to go up this way in order to get there. He's going to write the words of the Torah. He's going to write the blessings and the curses. They're going to speak those and announce those as they're required to. And it's not just for Israel to do that. In writing down the words of the Torah on these stones, on this plaster, it's also so that the rest of the peoples around them will be able to read, will be able to see and see what kind of life that they're supposed to live. It's basically it's to announce whose law is going to govern this land. So again, Joshua built an altar to Adonai, God of Israel, on Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of Adonai, had commanded Bnei Israel, as written in the scroll of the Torah of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no man had wielded any iron tool. They offered on it burnt offerings to Adonai and sacrificed fellowship offerings. There on the stones he wrote a copy of the Torah of Moses, which he had written in the presence of Bnei Israel. Then all of Israel, with their elders and officials and their judges, were standing on both sides of the ark, facing the Levitical priests, the Kohanim, carrying the ark of the covenant of Adonai, the outsider as well as the native born. So Joshua, he's writing on the Torah on the stones, because he covered them in plaster just like Moses had commanded. And here's the trick about this, about the plaster and such. They couldn't do this in just one moment and then be done with it for all time. There's a lot of things that if we've written on stone, if it's been chiseled and carved into stone, we still have it. Thousands of years, we can still read it many times if it's not been too exposed. But this is, by writing it on the plaster, this is not just a one and done kind of moment. Actually, they have to be very diligent to keep the words of the Torah on that altar and in that plaster. Because it's something we've said before. What happens to plaster over time? Especially when it's exposed to rain and sun and cold and heat. It decays. It doesn't necessarily hold up as well as a stone itself would. It dries out, it crumbles. So plaster must be maintained, plaster must be repaired. And if it's neglected, and they don't take care of it, they don't monitor it, they don't do what's necessary, then the words of the Torah will disappear. Not just from the altar or from the stones, but from their lives and from their actions, their way of life, and it will no longer be ruling over the land itself. So in order to keep the Torah written on this plaster, they would have to go in and repair it and have an upkeep with it, because there's a warning if they don't do these things. Verse 32 says, half of the Israelites, half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of Adonai, had commanded before, in order to bless the people of Israel. Then afterward he read all the words of the Torah, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the Torah. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, including the women and the little ones and the outsiders walking among them. Okay, so again, here we are. Obedience to God's command, to the Torah, was the basis of their victory. And seeing the fulfillment, their obedience to that was their necessity for really seeing the fulfillment of prophecy and promise. So this is the source of the blessing. This is the source of them seeing God's hand move in power. And again, the same is true for us in our lives. It's the same is true that's going to be the case in our future as well. Because we're never going to see the fulfillment of promise the way that we should. We're never going to see the hand of God move in power the way that we should. Never experience the fullness of the blessing that He has for us if we don't take His commands and His ways seriously. Yes, we may have a lot of things. Yes, we may have blessing in abundance, but we may not have as much as He would like to give. He would like to give even more. He would like to give more than we have. And that's where he is taking his people. That is, that life of blessing, that life in his presence, that's where he is taking us. That's the future that our Messiah has for us. Again, remember, crossing over the Jordan into the promised land, that's that picture of the second coming, the coming of Messiah, the Messianic kingdom, the 1,000-year reign. And remember Joshua, Yehoshua, he and Yeshua, they share a common name. So in many ways, Joshua is a type of the conquering Messiah, the son of David, Messiah ben David. So what Joshua does here also reveals what we know about what Messiah is going to do upon his return. So what does this moment say about, or reveal, what does it confirm about the return of Messiah, the 1,000-year reign? When he returns, is he going to fight a battle? Yes. He's going to be able to, he's got to take on the strongholds of the enemy and defeat them. So we know, just like Joshua in crossing over the land, he is going to have a fight. He's going to have a battle to take care of first thing. And he alone is going to receive the glory from that. He's not going to win because he has the angels behind him or the saints behind him. He's not going to win because he's got the host of heaven behind him. He is going to win on his glory and his authority alone. And then what does Messiah do? What do we read about in the book of Ezekiel? Upon the coming of the Messiah, upon the sitting upon the throne, we read in Ezekiel that Messiah is going to rebuild or restore the altar of God. That he is going to restore true worship. That's what Ezekiel is talking about when he's describing the Messianic temple that is built, right after the battle of Gog and Magog, after the defiling of the third temple. Messiah comes and he restores the altar. That starts in Ezekiel chapter 40, and it goes all the way through. There's this description of the temple that goes through chapter 46, and even including the restoration of the priesthood, the restoration of true worship. And so we see that right after he comes, right after he has a battle to take down the strongholds of the enemy, he's removing the defilement of false worship that exists in this world, and he sets up the true altar, the true temple, the true means of worship. And this is that ultimate fulfillment of what Yeshua is searching for. He is searching for worshipers who will worship him in what? In spirit and in truth. And that's the case because they'll be following his lead in that Messianic era with a restored worship at the altar of God. Yeshua was going to restore the altar just like Joshua did. And then what happens from that? Once that altar is restored, once true worship is restored, then the Torah goes forth from Zion. Remember, they built the altar, they offered the sacrifice on it, and then they wrote the words of the Torah on the stones with that plaster. The altar and the Torah, worship and the Word go hand in hand. And we need to understand that. Worship and the Word of God go hand in hand with each other. And so that's why you read about in the book of Revelation, Yeshua is looking for those who keep his commandments and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. He is looking for those things. And for us, once again, we should be aware that this is where he is taking us. This is where he is taking his people. He is taking us to the altar in his Father's house. And if we know that, we're also supposed to know the way. John chapter 14, verse 1, he says, "Do not let your heart be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. For in my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I am going to prepare a place for you? But if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, so that where I am, you may be also, and you know the way to where I am going. We're supposed to know. If this is where He wants us to go, if this is the direction that He wants us to be facing, to be oriented, to be going in, then it's best to start going in that direction now. Today. Because we love Him. Because we follow Him. This is the life that He is calling us to. And it's not a life that has to wait until the second coming. It's a life that can be a part of who we are as His people even now. And we do so because He's calling us to that. 14:6, Yeshua says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's the way that we should be going. That's the way that we should be living, and whom we should be following. And He continues in John 14 and verse 15, where He says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. He says in verse 21, he who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me. He who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will reveal myself to him. If we want to truly see His purposes, His plans, His promises fulfilled, then we need to walk in His ways. We need to follow and obey His word. Verse 23 says, Yeshua answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. My Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our dwelling with him. I don't know if y'all can read all of that. But we need to understand that that's where He's taking us. He wants us to experience that victory. He wants us to know that this is in our future. He is going to be taking us from the victory upon His initial return. He's going to be taking us to a restored worship and a restored place of His word. And so as the day of the Lord approaches, when He returns, that's when the victory and everything happens and occurs. But until then, is that an easy walk? Is there always victory in that before His return? See, we do need to understand that as the day of the Lord approaches, the world is going to make this way harder and harder, with more and more consequence and persecution for the people of God, for those who are striving to be faithful to God in His ways. So yes, we're going to see more and more of His victory, but we need to understand that the world is going to make it harder. He's going to try to get you to go a different way. He's going to make the different way, His way, a lot easier than the Lord's way. But even Yeshua said in Matthew chapter 24, all these things are only the beginning of birth pains. Then they will hand you over to persecution and will kill you. You will be hated by all the nations because of my name. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Before His return, it's going to get harder to walk in His way. And we need to be aware of that. We need to understand that. But it also means it's more important to continue. Verse 11 says, many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And that one of the enticing things about that is that it's like, hey, man, your life can get so much better, so much easier, if you would just quit going that way. But he says in verse 12, because lawlessness will multiply, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. As before His return, we need to be praying and seeking greater and greater endurance. We need to be seeking greater and greater support and encouragement from one another. And he says, this good news. Somehow there is good news in the midst of all of that difficulty. Somehow there is good news in the midst of what is getting worse. And we may tend to focus on things that look like they're getting worse or crazier or more hectic. But we need to understand that the good news is still very much alive and well, even in the midst of all of that. The good news of the kingdom, the good news of his coming, the good news of his return, the good news of his victory is still very much alive and well. This good news of the kingdom shall be proclaimed in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So even in the midst of all this turmoil and trouble, even in the midst of the hardships and consequences increasing, even in the midst of the love of many growing cold and people turning away and being deceived, even in the midst of people turning on each other and turning each other in, the good news of the kingdom is supposed to be proclaimed louder and clearer. That doesn't always make sense, but that's what it calls for. So as we see these things happening, the world is going to tempt us to keep our mouth shut. But what does the Lord want us to do? He wants us to speak up even more. He wants us to be louder with that truth. But what it takes, are you prepared to endure to the end? Are you prepared for the consequences of what may be happening before his coming? Are you keeping his commandments? Are you holding to the testimony of Yeshua? This is that passage again with 1 Peter 3 that we've talked about before. Always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you for the reason and the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect, so that those who speak against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. Always be prepared to give an answer. Again, that's being prepared for the consequences of the answer that you give, because it may cost us. But that's one reason why we're going to need each other. And are you prepared to endure? Because the victory is very sure. The victory is very true. That's what Joshua shows us is going to happen in those days. Upon his return, Yeshua is going to be victorious, and he is going to take down all the strongholds of the enemy. And he is going to restore that true worship among his people. And then the Torah will go forth to all the nations. That's what we have to look forward to. That's what we have to be assured of. That's what we have to live for, even now. And so as we see the days getting a little crazier, as we see things getting a little harder, we need to understand that it's worth it. We need to understand that he is worth it. And we need to understand that there will be a great victory and a great glory that is revealed upon his coming. For he alone is worthy to take up the scroll and open the seals.